I sat motionless in the corner of the living room, back straight, hands resting on my knees according to strict regulation, observing the crowd of relatives who were making noise like a broken market rather than a funeral. The lawyer had barely opened his mouth when my father stood up abruptly, cutting him off with a booming, domineering voice. The 3 properties in San Diego belong to my son. As for Alivia, the military has already raised her. She does not need, and will not receive, a single cent. Applause erupted, and my mother nodded in agreement. My throat tasted bitter. Not because of the lost money, but because of their naked cruelty. The pulse in my neck accelerated with rage, but my facial muscles remained in the frozen state forged through thousands of hours of duty. Ryan raised his wineglass toward me, his eyes full of the teasing look of a victor. He and this entire room had no idea, though, that Lieutenant Alivia Matthews did not come here to beg. I glanced at the metal briefcase locked tight at my feet, containing a truth that had lain dormant for 3 years, and wondered, how fast will their smiles fade when they realize that will is just a piece of scrap paper? The air in the Matthews estate in Pacific Beach was thick, suffocating under the scent of warm shrimp cocktail and cheap Chardonnay poured into expensive crystal flutes. 30 guests, mostly Ryan's drinking buddies and Dad's old business associates, were turning Grandma Margaret's wake into a networking mixer. No one mentioned her name. No one shared a memory of the woman who had built this family's fortune from a single delivery truck. They only whispered about property values and capital gains tax. I sat there, an alien in my service dress blues, a sharp black ink stain on their pastel canvas. Across the room, Ryan sat with his feet propped up on the mahogany coffee table, his arm draped around Brooke. Her acrylic nails, long and curved like the talons of a hawk, tapped against her glass as she giggled. I could hear Ryan's stage whisper cutting through the din. Just wait, babe. That Porsche 911 is going to be sitting in the garage by next week. The greed wasn't even masked anymore. It was naked, ugly, and breathing all the air in the room. Then came the full sentencing, amplifying the shock I had just felt. My father, Thomas Matthews, adjusted his tie, standing in the center of the room like a king addressing his subjects. He did not look at me. His gaze swept over my head as if I were a piece of invisible furniture. Ryan is the firstborn, he announced, his voice booming with a manufactured authority that he always mistook for leadership. He needs a solid foundation to build a family. He carries the Matthews name. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence hang heavy before twisting the knife he had already planted. As for Alivia, he gestured vaguely in my direction. She chose to leave this family to play soldier. She has her pension. She has her health insurance. She has that GI Bill thing. She has been taken care of by Uncle Sam. Therefore, Grandma's legacy will go to the one who actually needs it. Ryan. The room erupted in applause again. They were clapping for my dispossession. They were cheering for the logic that my service, my sacrifice, and my independence were the very reasons I deserved to be punished. I turned my head slowly toward my mother, hoping to find a single shred of fairness. But Susan Matthews just looked down, her fingers nervously twisting her string of fake pearls. When she finally met my gaze, there was no apology in her eyes. She walked over, her steps hesitant, and placed a cold hand on my shoulder. She leaned in, whispering loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, performing her role of the peacemaker. Alivia, please, don't make a scene. Your brother is sensitive. You are the strong one, right? You have always been the survivor. You don't need these old houses. Let him have this so the family can be at peace. There it was. The weaponization of my resilience. In her eyes, the fact that I didn't cry meant I didn't bleed. She was asking me to carve off my own flesh to feed her spoiled golden child, simply because I could endure the pain. Thank you, Dad. Thank you, Mom. I promise to make this family proud, Ryan shouted, standing up. His face was flushed with alcohol and arrogance. He raised his glass toward me, a smirk playing on his lips. Don't be sad, soldier girl, he jeered. If things get too tight on that government salary, I can lend you a few thousand. But remember, I charge interest. Brooke shrieked with laughter, a high-pitched sound that grated against my nerves. The humiliation was complete. They had stripped me down, invalidated my existence, and were now dancing on the ashes. I felt the weight of the Halliburton aluminum briefcase resting against my combat boot. Inside were 8 property deeds, stamped with red seals, signed and notarized 3 years ago. I closed my eyes for a microsecond. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. The box breathing technique of the Navy SEALs kicked in, forcing my heart rate down from a sprint to a steady jog. The rage was still there, but now it was cold. It was focused. It was ammunition. I did not stand up to scream. I did not throw my drink. I simply looked past my father, past Ryan, and locked eyes with the family attorney, Mr. Hollis, who was already reaching for his pen to finalize the paperwork. My voice cut through the celebration like a knife through silk. "Mr. Hollis," I said, my tone flat and devoid of emotion, "before you let them sign, are you absolutely certain your file was updated after May of 2021? To understand why I didn't scream at the lawyer or throw my drink in my brother's face, you have to go back 15 years. You have to sit at the Matthews dinner table and feel the specific texture of silence that was reserved just for me. The memory is thick with the smell of hickory-smoked barbecue ribs and the blaring sound of the television tuned to ESPN. My father sat at the head of the table, wielding his fork like a scepter, dispensing his attention like a limited currency. "Ryan, tell me about that touchdown pass in the second quarter," Dad asked, his eyes gleaming with vicarious glory. Ryan, his mouth full of cornbread, shrugged with practiced nonchalance. "Coach called the wrong play, honestly. If the offensive line wasn't so slow, I would have had 3 more. But yeah, that one throw was elite." Dad nodded sagely, blaming the coach, the line, the referees, blaming the entire world for the fact that Ryan's varsity team had actually lost the game 14-35. In Dad's version of reality, Ryan never lost. He was only failed by others. At the far end of the table, I quietly slid a piece of paper onto the tablecloth. It was my semester report card. Straight A's, calculus, A+, physics, A. I smoothed the edges, waiting. I waited for a pause in the football commentary. I waited for a glance. The paper sat there between the coleslaw and the napkins, white and stark. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, Dad looked in my direction. "Alivia," he grunted, pointing his knife at the empty platter. "We're out of ribs. Go check the kitchen and clear these plates while you are up." He hadn't even seen the paper, or maybe he had, and it simply didn't register as important. I was not a person to be celebrated. I was the staff. I was the ghost who washed the dishes while the real family discussed legacy. The invisible divide turned into a canyon during my junior year of high school. It was homecoming week. Ryan, then a senior, decided he needed a new look to impress the cheerleaders. I watched from the doorway of the master bedroom as Mom sat on the edge of the bed, her checkbook open. Ryan was holding up a garment bag containing an Italian wool suit. $800, Susan? Dad asked, raising an eyebrow, though he was already reaching for his wallet. "He needs to look the part, Tom," Mom insisted, smiling at her golden boy. "It's an investment in his confidence." She swiped the credit card without blinking. $800 for a night of dancing and spiked punch. Later that same week, I approached Mom in the kitchen. I had been researching colleges, aiming for the Ivy League or the Naval Academy. "Mom," I asked, my voice small, "I need to buy the advanced SAT prep books. The set is $50. Mom sighed, a long dramatic exhalation that sucked the air out of the room. She looked at me with a pained expression, as if I had just asked her to donate a kidney. "Alivia, honestly," she snapped, scrubbing a pot with aggressive force. "We are a little tight on cash right now. Can't you just borrow them from the library?" "Why are you always so demanding? You need to learn to be less selfish." Selfish. The word hung in the air. $800 for a suit Ryan would vomit on was an investment. $50 for my future was selfish. That afternoon, as Ryan drove off in Dad's brand new Ford Mustang to pick up his date, I put on my cousin's hand-me-down dress that was 2 sizes too big. I realized then that in the ledger of the Matthews family, Ryan was an asset and I was a liability. The final severance happened 3 years later. I came home, my heart hammering against my ribs, clutching a thick envelope. "I got in," I said, placing the acceptance letter to the Navy officer candidate school on the coffee table. Dad glanced at it during a commercial break. "Navy, huh? Well, that's good. Saves me tuition money." He turned back to the screen. "It suits you, Alivia. The military is structured. You don't need to worry about being overly feminine there. You just follow orders. No congratulations, no hug, no, 'I'm proud of you.' Just relief that I was off the payroll and a backhanded comment about my womanhood." When the day came to report to Newport, Rhode Island, I packed my single duffel bag. I stood in the foyer, waiting. "I can't drive you to the bus station, honey," Mom called out from upstairs. Ryan chipped a tooth opening a beer bottle. "I have to get him to the dentist." "And I have a tea time at 10, Dad added, checking his watch. "You can call an Uber, right? You're independent." I took a Greyhound bus. As the heavy diesel engine roared to life and the bus pulled away from the curb, I looked out the window at the empty sidewalk. I realized I wasn't leaving my family because I never really had one. Newport was cold, wet, and miserable. They called it Hell Week for a reason. I was crawling through freezing mud, my lungs burning, while a drill instructor screamed inches from my face, insulting my weakness, my form, my very existence. And for the first time in my life, I felt peace. It sounds insane, but it was true. When the sergeant yelled at me, he wasn't doing it because I was Alivia, the invisible daughter. He was doing it because my push-up form was wrong. It was objective. It was fair. One morning, during inspection, the instructor stopped at my bunk. He took a quarter and bounced it off my sheets. It sprang into the air. He checked the corners, perfect 45-degree angles. He looked me in the eye. "Outstanding candidate." That single word fed a hunger I didn't know I had. I learned the creed of Jocko Willink. Discipline equals freedom. The military didn't break me. It forged me. It taught me that love isn't a scarce resource you have to beg for at the dinner table. Respect is earned through action. Every morning I made my bed, I was building a wall between me and the people who made me feel small. I became hard. I became sharp. I became a weapon. And weapons do not cry when they are cut out of a will. They reload. My suspicions didn't start at the funeral. They started 3 years ago, during a 96-hour Liberty Pass I took to visit Grandma Margaret. As soon as I unlocked the front door of the ancestral home in the suburbs, the smell hit me. It wasn't the scent of lavender and baking bread I remembered from childhood. It was the heavy, cloying odor of wet drywall and mildew. I found Grandma sitting in her favorite armchair, a knitted blanket pulled up to her chin despite the mild California autumn. In the corner of the living room, a plastic Home Depot bucket sat on the Persian rug. Drip, drip, drip. The sound was rhythmic and maddening, like a slow-ticking clock counting down the decay of the house. "Grandma," I asked, my chest tightening, "why is there a bucket in the living room? Why haven't you called a roofer?" She smiled at me, but her eyes were cloudy, filled with a resignation that broke my heart. "I told Ryan, sweetie. He handles the accounts now. He said the roof quotes are astronomical. He said the maintenance fund is running on fumes. He told me I just have to be patient and wait out one more rainy season." I looked at the water-stained ceiling, then at the bucket filled with murky brown water. Running on fumes? Grandma owned 8 rental properties in San Diego, one of the hottest real estate markets in the country. Those units had been fully occupied since the 1990s. The idea that there wasn't enough cash to fix a patch of roof wasn't just unlikely, it was mathematically impossible. That night, after Grandma took her medication and went to sleep, I didn't go to bed. I went to the mahogany desk in the study and found the ledger. I am a Supply Corps officer. My day job involves managing millions of dollars in military assets, tracking supply chains from factories in the Midwest to carrier strike groups in the Pacific. I know how to spot a discrepancy. In my world, if a single screw is missing, we stop the line until we find it. Ryan's bookkeeping wasn't just messy, it was a crime scene. There were no original receipts, only scribbled notes in the margins. I ran my finger down the columns. Plumbing repair, $3,500. Landscaping service, $2,200 per month. I snorted in the quiet room. $2,200? For what? The rental properties had gravel yards and succulents that required zero water. He was billing the estate for a landscaping crew that likely didn't exist. The next morning, the sound of a V6 twin-turbo engine shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. I looked out the window to see Ryan pulling into the driveway. He wasn't driving his old sedan. He was behind the wheel of a brand-new Ford F-150 Raptor. The truck was a beast, painted a glossy code orange, sitting on 37-inch tires. Sticker price? At least $75,000. He hopped out, wearing Oakley sunglasses and holding a venti Starbucks cup. He looked like the picture of health and wealth, a stark contrast to the grandmother shivering inside her damp house. "Hey, sis," he called out, spotting me on the porch. "Home on leave?" I pointed a finger at the truck. "Nice ride, Ryan. Where did the money come from? Dad said you were between jobs." Ryan shrugged, taking a long sip of his $7 coffee. "Crypto, Alivia. You wouldn't understand. I made some smart moves with Bitcoin. Anyway, don't nag me about the roof. Materials are insane right now. Supply chain issues, you know?" He used the buzzwords he heard on the news to cover his tracks. He lied to my face without blinking. He lied while standing 10 feet away from the woman who raised him, the woman who was currently catching rainwater in a plastic bucket while he drove a tank that cost more than most people earn in a year. But I needed hard proof. I needed a smoking gun. I found it on page 42 of the ledger. HVAC replacement, Garnet Avenue property, $8,000. The date was from last month. I got in my car and drove straight to the rental on Garnet Avenue. It was a hot day, pushing 85 degrees. When the tenant, a guy named Mike, opened the door, a wave of heat hit me. He was sweating through his t-shirt. "New AC unit?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. Mike let out a bitter laugh. "Are you kidding me? The AC has been dead for 3 months. I've called Ryan a dozen times. He ghosted me. I'm literally drafting a lawsuit right now for breach of habitability. Mind if I see the unit?" He led me to the side yard. There it was. A rusted, rattling metal box. I checked the serial number plate. Manufactured in 1990. I took out my phone and snapped a photo of the rusted unit. Then I took a photo of the serial number. Ryan hadn't spent $8,000 on a new air conditioner. He had pocketed the money, likely for a down payment on that orange truck, and left a paying tenant to roast in the heat and his grandmother to rot in the damp. This wasn't just incompetence, it wasn't just golden child syndrome. This was elder abuse. This was fraud. This was a felony. If you are listening to this and your blood is boiling, I need you to do something for me right now. If you believe that stealing from your own grandmother is the lowest thing a human being can do, hit that like button. And if you want to see Ryan face justice, type the word karma in the comments below. Let me know I'm not fighting this alone. I walked back to my car, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, lethal rage. I looked at the photo of the rusted machine one last time. Ryan thought he was untouchable because he was the favorite son. He thought Dad would protect him. He thought Mom would make excuses for him. But he had never gone to war with the logistics officer. He didn't know that I wasn't just going to expose him, I was going to dismantle him. I drove back to Grandma's house that night through a torrential downpour. The thunder rattled the windows of my sedan like distant artillery fire, matching the storm brewing in my gut. I had the photos of the rusted air conditioner and the ledger pages tucked under my arm. When I entered the living room, Grandma was still in her chair, staring at the bucket of rainwater. I didn't sugarcoat it. I laid the photos on the tea table, spreading them out like a winning poker hand. "He's robbing you, Grandma," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Ryan is bleeding the estate dry. Here is the proof." Grandma Margaret put on her reading glasses. Her hand shook as she picked up the photo of the 1990s HVAC unit. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She just sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of a decade of betrayal. "I know," she whispered, her voice raspy. I froze. "You know? Then why? Why do you let him live like a king while you sit here in the damp?" She took off her glasses and looked at me, her eyes filled with a pain that had nothing to do with money. "Because your father, Thomas, he gave me an ultimatum. 3 years ago, when I first questioned Ryan's spending, Thomas told me that if I made a scene, if I involved lawyers or the police, he would cut me off." She reached out and squeezed my hand. "He said he would make sure I never saw you again, Olivia. He said he would tell you I had gone senile and refused to let you visit. He held you hostage against my silence." The air left my lungs. My father hadn't just enabled Ryan. He had weaponized his relationship with me to blackmail his own mother. He had monetized his access to his daughter to protect his son's theft. That was the moment the last thread of loyalty I felt for Thomas Matthews snapped. He wasn't my father anymore. He was a hostile combatant. Grandma Margaret straightened her back. The frailty seemed to evaporate, replaced by the steel of the woman who had run a logistics empire in the 80s. "Alivia," she said, her voice dropping an octave, commanding and sharp. "I am not going to let my husband's legacy be picked apart by vultures. You are the only one in this family with discipline. You are the only one who knows the value of $1 because you actually work for yours." She pointed a bony finger at me. "I want to transfer everything, all of it, to you, right now, before I die." "Dad will kill me," I blurted out, the old fear rising up. She smiled, a cold, dry expression. "He won't be able to do a damn thing, not if the paperwork is bulletproof." "Do you have the courage to accept this mission, Lieutenant?" I looked at the bucket of water. I looked at her fierce eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Monday morning, 0800 hours. We initiated the operation. I called Dylan, my second cousin. He was a mechanic, a blue-collar guy who drove a beat-up Silverado and hated the pretension of my immediate family. He agreed to be our driver without asking questions. We loaded Grandma into Dylan's truck and drove downtown, parking in the alleyway behind the office of Davis & Associates. Mr. Davis was an old family friend, an estate attorney who knew where all the bodies were buried. We went in through the back door to avoid being seen by any of Dad's business cronies who might be lunching nearby. Mr. Davis had the documents ready on his mahogany desk. "This is a revocable living trust," Mr. Davis explained, sliding a thick stack of papers toward us. "It bypasses probate, it bypasses the will, it supersedes everything." He pointed to the specific clause. Sole beneficiary, Alivia Margaret Matthews. Successor trustee, Alivia Margaret Matthews. Then came the quitclaim deeds. 8 of them, 1 for each property. Grandma didn't hesitate. She picked up the pen and began to sign. Scritch, scratch. The sound of the ink flowing onto the heavy legal bond paper was loud in the quiet office. To me, it sounded like the metallic click of a magazine being loaded into a rifle. With every signature, she was stripping Ryan of his power. With every stamp of the notary's seal, she was reclaiming her dignity. Pacific Beach House, signed. Garnet Avenue Rentals, signed. The Commercial Warehouse, signed. When the last document was notarized, Grandma looked at me. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear. "Listen to me, Alivia," she commanded, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "This is the most important part." Radio silence. "Radio silence," I repeated. "From now until the day I'm in the ground, and even after that, until the very moment they try to take it, you say nothing. You let Ryan drive that truck. You let Thomas brag at the country club. You let them sleep soundly in their arrogance. You let them think they have won. Because when the enemy is comfortable, he is careless." I nodded, locking the strategy into my mind. "Understood." I walked out of that office carrying a secret worth millions of dollars. I went back to my unit. I deployed overseas. And for 3 agonizing years, I watched from a distance. I watched Ryan drain the bank accounts. I watched my parents fawn over him. I watched them treat me like a nuisance. I endured every insult, every snub, every condescending remark about my government salary. I held my tongue because I knew something they didn't. I knew that every dollar Ryan stole was just evidence building a case against him. I knew that the ground they were standing on didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to the ghost in the back of the room. The soil on Grandma Margaret's grave wasn't even dry yet when the ambush happened. We had just returned from the cemetery. The black limousines were still idling in the driveway, and the guests were filtering into the living room for the wake. But before I could even take off my white gloves, my father gripped my elbow. His fingers dug into my arm with a force that was less like a hug and more like a handcuff. "Study. Now," he muttered, his voice low and tight. "Family meeting." I followed him into his home office. The room smelled of old leather and expensive cigar smoke, the scent of a club I was never allowed to join. Dad marched behind his massive oak desk and sat down, assuming the position of the judge. Mom sat in the guest chair, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. Ryan leaned against the bookshelf, crossing his ankles, looking like a tragic victim who had just been terribly inconvenienced by a death in the family. On the desk, sitting alone on the green blotter, was a single document. Dad didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid the paper toward me along with his heavy black resin Mont Blanc pen. "Sign it, Alivia," he ordered. I looked down. The title at the top read, "Disclaimer of Interest." "What is this?" I asked, though I knew exactly what it was. "It is a formality," Dad said, waving his hand dismissively. "It states that you voluntarily waive any claim to your grandmother's estate. It streamlines the transfer of assets to Ryan." "We don't want to get courts and lawyers involved, do we? That gets messy. That gets expensive. We are a family. We handle things internally." They weren't asking me. They were commanding me to rob myself. Before I could respond, Mom started her performance. She reached out and touched my hand, her face crumpling into a mask of maternal concern. "Olivia, sweetheart, please look at your brother," she said, gesturing to the 36-year-old man who was currently checking his text messages. "Ryan needs stability. He's getting married to Brooke. He needs to provide. You are gone all the time on your deployments. You aren't here to manage properties." She took a breath, and then she delivered the blow that she had been saving for years. "Besides, honey," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "you are a woman. Eventually, you will get married. You will change your name. The assets, they really should stay with the Matthews name. Ryan is the only son. He carries the legacy. You understand, don't you? It's just the natural order of things." My stomach turned. There it was. The sexism wasn't even subtle. In Susan Matthews's world, my biology rendered me incapable of stewardship. Because I didn't have the right plumbing, I didn't deserve the legacy. She was using my gender to validate her theft. Then Ryan pushed off the bookshelf and sauntered over. He put a heavy hand on my shoulder, squeezing it in a way that felt patronizing. "Come on, sis," he said, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't be difficult. Sign the paper, and I'll make it worth your while. Tell you what, once I sell the Pacific Beach house, I will buy you that Hermes bag you see all the celebrities carrying. A Birkin, a Kelly, whatever you want. On me." I looked at him. He truly believed that my dignity could be bought with a purse. He thought I was a shallow child who could be distracted by a shiny object while he stole millions of dollars in real estate. The silence in the room stretched thin, like a rubber band about to snap. They were all looking at me, Dad with his authority, Mom with her guilt, Ryan with his bribe, waiting for me to submit, waiting for the good daughter to fold. I know many of you listening right now have stood in a room just like this. You have been told to keep the peace at the expense of your own soul. You have been told that family comes first by the very people who put you last. If you are tired of being gaslighted by the people who are supposed to protect you, hit that like button right now. And if you would refuse to sign that paper, type "respect" in the comments. Show me that you know your own worth. I picked up the document. I felt the texture of the paper between my thumb and forefinger. Then I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. And finally, I looked at Ryan. My expression didn't change. My pulse didn't race. I was calm. I was deadly calm. "You ask me who I am, I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the air in the room. I am a lieutenant in the United States Navy. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I paused, letting the words hang there. And I have realized something today, I continued, locking eyes with my father. Greed is an enemy. Manipulation is an enemy. I took the disclaimer of interest in both hands. Rip! The sound was loud, violent, and final. I tore the document in half, then in quarters. I let the pieces flutter down onto Dad's pristine desk like snow. I will not sign anything, I said. And I don't want your handbag, Ryan. I want what is mine. You ungrateful little... Ryan started to lunge forward, his face turning red. I wouldn't do that, I warned, shifting my stance slightly. See you at the reading of the will. I turned on my heel and walked out of the study, leaving the door wide open behind me. Behind me, I could hear the stunned silence turning into chaos, but I didn't look back. The war had officially begun. For the 3 days leading up to the reading of the will, I did not sleep. I did not eat. I operated on black coffee and the cold, hard adrenaline of a mission commander preparing for a strike. My temporary apartment in downtown San Diego looked less like a home and more like a tactical operations center. My dining table was buried under stacks of paper, legal pads, and the glowing blue light of 2 laptop screens. I wasn't just waiting for the meeting, I was building a case. I logged into the San Diego County Assessor's public portal. It is a dry, boring database to most people, but to me, it was a goldmine. I downloaded the transaction history for every single property in the Matthews portfolio. Then, I cross-referenced them with the bank statements I'd subpoenaed through the Living Trust's authority. What I found made my jaw tighten. Ryan hadn't just been stealing cash for maintenance fraud, he had been trying to leverage the equity of the houses. There were 3 rejected loan applications from predatory lenders, the kind of places that charged 20% interest. Ryan had tried to use Grandma's Pacific Beach house as collateral for a quick cash infusion, likely to cover his crypto losses. But the banks had denied him. Why? Because when they ran the title search, the name on the deed didn't match his. I printed every rejection letter. I printed the tax records showing penalties for late payments. Each piece of paper was a bullet. I didn't just throw them in a pile. I organized them with the obsessive precision of a logistics officer. Yellow highlighter for fraud, pink highlighter for negligence, blue highlighter for tax evasion. I punched holes in the documents and slotted them into navy blue binders. Snap, snap. The sound of the metal rings closing was rhythmic, soothing. By Friday night, I didn't have a pile of complaints. I had a weaponized dossier. On Saturday morning, the day of the reckoning, I made one phone call. Dylan, I said when my cousin picked up. Are you free this afternoon? Yeah, he stammered, the sound of a wrench clanking in the background. Just fixing the truck. Why? I need you at the house for the reading of the will. 2 o'clock sharp. Wear a collared shirt. There was a long pause on the line. Dylan was a good kid, a mechanic who stayed out of family drama, but he wasn't stupid. Alivia, he said, his voice dropping. Are you really going to do this? Uncle Thomas? He isn't looking good. His blood pressure is high. If you blow this up, he might have a heart attack. I looked at the stack of evidence on my table. I thought about the bucket of rainwater in Grandma's living room. I thought about the way Dad had blackmailed his own mother. He made his choice, Dylan, I said, my voice flat. He chose his side 3 years ago. Now, he has to face the consequences of that choice. I just need a witness, someone who isn't on his payroll. Will you be there? I'll be there, Dylan sighed. At 1300 hours, I began the ritual of suiting up. Most people would wear a black dress to a wake. They would wear something modest, blending in with the mourning crowd. But I wasn't going there to mourn. I was going there to preside over a court-martial. I opened my garment bag and pulled out my service dress blues. The fabric was heavy, immaculate, and lint-free. I stepped into the trousers, pulling them up and securing the waist. I buttoned the white shirt, ensuring the collar was starched stiff enough to cut glass. Then came the jacket. Double-breasted, gold buttons. I stood in front of the full-length mirror. I brushed my hair back, pulling it tight against my scalp, twisting it into a regulation bun that sat perfectly at the nape of my neck. Not a single strand was out of place. No softness. No femininity for them to mock. I pinned my ribbon rack to my left chest. The Navy Achievement Medal glinted under the bathroom lights. I had earned that for optimizing a vaccine supply chain during a global crisis, saving thousands of man-hours. My family called it government work. I called it competence. I looked at my reflection. The girl who used to beg for $50 for SAT books was gone. The woman staring back was Lieutenant Matthews. She represented honor, courage, and commitment. And she was about to bring the Uniform Code of Military Justice into her parents' living room. Before I left, I reached into my nightstand and pulled out the small leather-bound Bible Grandma Margaret had given me the day I commissioned. A bookmark was tucked into the pages. I opened it to Psalm 118, verse 22. I read the words aloud, a quiet incantation against the gaslighting I was about to face. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. I closed the book and slipped it into my pocket. Finally, I reached down and picked up the Halliburton aluminum briefcase. It was heavy, cold, and indestructible. I placed the navy blue binders inside, nestling them next to the original trust documents. Click! Click! The sound of the latches locking echoed in the empty apartment like the racking of a shotgun slide. I checked my watch. Time to go. I picked up the case, walked out the door, and didn't look back. The silence was over. The hunter was coming home. My question about the file date hung in the air like the smoke from a fired pistol. Mr. Hollis blinked, his pen hovering over the signature line of the will. "Excuse me?" he stammered, his brow furrowing. "The file was last updated in 2018. Why would that matter?" I didn't answer him, not with words. I bent down and lifted the Halliburton aluminum briefcase. I set it onto the glass coffee table with a heavy metallic thud that silenced the room. With a deliberate sweep of my arm, I pushed the half-empty glasses of Chardonnay and the crystal flutes aside, clearing the battlefield. Click! Click! The sound of the latches snapping open was crisp and loud in the sudden quiet. I lifted the lid. Inside, the navy blue binders and the stack of legal documents sat organized with military precision. I reached in and pulled out the first document. I held it up high, letting the overhead chandelier illuminate the official red stamp of the San Diego County Clerk. "This," I said, my voice calm, steady, and terrifyingly flat, "is a grant deed for the Pacific Beach property." I dropped it onto the table in front of Mr. Hollis. Owner of record, Alivia Margaret Matthews. Date of recording, May 14, 2021, 3 years ago. I reached back into the case. "Here's the deed for the Garnet Avenue rentals, transferred." I slapped it down. "Here's the warehouse on Miramar Road, transferred." Slap. "Here's the family home we are standing in right now, transferred." Slap. I looked at my father, who had turned a shade of gray I had never seen before. "The will you just read is worthless, Dad. Grandma didn't leave you the empire. She gave it to the only person she trusted not to burn it to the ground." The room erupted into murmurs. Mr. Hollis snatched the first deed, his hands trembling as he pulled a pair of reading glasses from his pocket. He scrutinized the seal. He checked the notary acknowledgement. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. "This, Thomas, this is authentic," the lawyer stuttered, looking up at my father with wide, panicked eyes. "The chain of title is clear. It was a transfer into a revocable living trust, and then a quitclaim to Alivia. It supersedes the will. The assets were not Margaret's to give when she died. They already belonged to Alivia. The empire my father thought he controlled, the legacy he had just handed to his golden boy, dissolved instantly. He collapsed back into his armchair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The power he held over me, the money, the inheritance, the threat of exclusion, was gone. But Ryan wasn't ready to accept defeat. His face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. The veins in his neck bulged as the reality of his destitution hit him. "You liar!" he screamed, spraying spit as he lunged toward the table. He swiped at the papers, sending them fluttering to the floor. You manipulated her. She was senile. She didn't know what she was signing. You forced her. He charged at me, his fist cocked back. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I dropped into a modified ready stance, feet shoulder-width apart, hands raised to guard my center line. I was a trained naval officer. He was a drunk frat boy in a suit. Don't touch me, Ryan, I warned, my voice dropping to a command register. She was crazy, Ryan yelled, looking around the room for support. Everyone knows Grandma was losing her mind. This is fraud. No, she wasn't. The voice came from the back of the room. Dylan, my cousin in his flannel shirt and work boots, stepped forward. He walked through the crowd of stunned guests until he stood next to me. I drove her to the lawyer's office, Ryan, Dylan said, his voice deep and steady. I sat there for 2 hours while she reviewed every single paragraph with Mr. Davis. She wasn't crazy. She was heartbroken. She told the lawyer exactly why she was doing it. She said she was doing it because you were stealing from her and Uncle Thomas was covering it up. A collective gasp went through the room. The guests, the business partners, the hangers-on, they all turned their eyes to Ryan and my father. The mask had slipped. They weren't the grieving family. They were the thieves. Ryan stood frozen, his chest heaving, trapped by the undeniable truth. He looked at Mom, begging for her to fix it, but she had buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. I bent down and picked up the deeds, dusting them off with exaggerated care. Then I placed them back into the briefcase and snapped it shut. I looked at my parents. You always said Ryan needed a chance to grow up, I said, my voice cutting through the sound of my mother's crying. Well, this is his chance. Sink or swim. I turned my gaze to Ryan, who looked small and pathetic without his unearned inheritance. I am giving you 48 hours to clear your personal effects out of the management office, I stated, checking my watch. If you are not gone by Monday at 5 p.m., I will have the county sheriff remove you for trespassing. And Ryan, I have already audited the books. Don't try to delete anything. I have backups. I picked up the handle of the case. It felt lighter now. Enjoy the shrimp cocktail, I said to the silent room. I turned and walked toward the front door, my boots clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor, leaving the chaos behind me. On Monday morning, exactly 48 hours after the reading of the will, I arrived at the property management office. I did not come alone. I brought a San Diego County Sheriff's deputy with me for a civil standby. It is a standard procedure when you expect an eviction to turn volatile, and Ryan did not disappoint. The office, which used to be organized and clean under Grandma's watch, smelled like stale tequila and panic. Ryan was frantically shoving papers into a cardboard box. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt untucked. When he saw me standing in the doorway with the uniformed officer, he didn't freeze. He exploded. You can't do this, he screamed, hurling a stapler across the room. It hit the drywall with a dull thud. I built this business. You drained this business, I corrected him, my voice calm. Officer, would you please ensure he only takes personal items? No hard drives, no files. Ryan let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush, but he stopped throwing things. He rushed to the desktop computer and started hammering on the keyboard. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to format the drive. He was trying to erase the evidence of the landscaping kickbacks and the fake invoices. I walked over and unplugged the tower from the wall. Don't bother, I said. I cloned the drive remotely on Saturday night. Every deleted email, every altered spreadsheet, it is already on a server in the cloud. Ryan slumped into his chair, defeated by technology he didn't understand and a sister he had underestimated. Outside, the collapse of his facade continued with brutal efficiency. A tow truck was backing into the driveway. It wasn't just any tow truck, it was a repo man. The bank hadn't wasted time. Ryan hadn't made a payment on the Ford F-150 Raptor in 3 months. I watched through the window as the hook was attached to the bumper of the $70,000 truck. The code orange paint gleamed in the sun one last time before it was dragged away, leaving oil stains on the pavement. But the repo man was kind compared to Brooke. She arrived just as Ryan was being escorted out of the building with his box of desk toys. She wasn't there to comfort him. She had heard the news, probably from the text I sent to the tenants directing all future rent payments to the new trust account. She knew the gravy train had derailed. "You told me you owned those buildings," she shrieked, standing in the parking lot in her designer heels. "You told me you were a millionaire." "Babe, listen, it is just a legal mix-up," Ryan pleaded, reaching for her hand. She pulled back as if he were contagious. Then, she did something that made the sheriff look away in second-hand embarrassment. She pulled the diamond engagement ring off her finger. "I took this to the jeweler this morning to see what I could get for it," she yelled, throwing the ring at his chest. "It is cubic zirconia, Ryan. You proposed to me with a piece of glass." The ring bounced off his polo shirt and clattered onto the asphalt. Brooke didn't wait for an Uber. She got into her own car and peeled out of the lot, leaving Ryan standing there with nothing but a box of bobbleheads and a fake diamond in the dirt. My parents arrived 10 minutes too late to stop the carnage. They stood by their sedan, watching their golden boy sitting on the curb, weeping into his hands. They looked older, smaller. Mom looked at me, her eyes begging for mercy. "Alivia, please, we can fix this. We can take a loan against our house to help him pay back the estate." I shook my head slowly. "You can't, Mom." "Why not?" Dad asked, his voice trembling. "Because I checked the public records," I said, delivering the final blow. "You already took out a second mortgage on your house 6 months ago. You gave that money to Ryan to pay off his gambling debts, didn't you? You have no equity left. If you try to bail him out again, you will be homeless." They stood in stunned silence. The reality of their enabling had finally caught up with them. They had bet the farm on the wrong horse, and now the race was over. The worst part, however, wasn't the eviction or the breakup. It was the letter that arrived at my apartment 3 days later. It was a subpoena. Ryan hadn't just stolen from Grandma. In his desperation to maintain his lifestyle, he had inflated his income on federal loan applications. He had claimed the rental income as his own. That is bank fraud. And because he had been pocketing cash rent from tenants to avoid a paper trail, he hadn't declared it on his taxes. That is tax evasion. The IRS does not care about family drama. They care about math. And Ryan's math didn't add up. I sat at my table and signed the witness statement. I packed the navy blue binders, the ones containing the highlighted bank statements and the photos of the rusted air conditioner, into a shipping box addressed to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I wasn't doing this for revenge anymore. I was doing it because the law required it. But as I taped the box shut, I couldn't help but think, karma has a way of balancing the ledger. That night, I sat alone in my apartment. The adrenaline of the battle had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest. I poured myself a glass of water and looked at the framed photo of Grandma Margaret on my desk. I had won. The estate was safe. The thief was facing federal prison. The enablers were facing bankruptcy. Justice had been served, cold and precise. But the silence in my apartment was deafening. My phone didn't ring. There were no angry texts from Ryan, no guilt-tripping voicemails from Mom. They had finally realized that I was unreachable. I was victorious, but I was also an orphan. I had living parents and a living brother, but the family I yearned for, the one that loved me unconditionally, had died long before Grandma Margaret. I took a sip of water and stared at the empty wall. It was a bitter drink, this freedom. But as I thought about the lies, the theft, and the gaslighting, I realized one thing. I would rather be lonely in the truth than warm in a house built on lies. With the parasites removed, the host began to heal. I treated the management of the Matthews estate not as a family hobby, but as a military operation. I replaced Ryan's chaotic, napkin-scribbled bookkeeping with standard operating procedures adapted from the Navy Supply Corps. The first rule I implemented was the 24-hour service level agreement. If a tenant reported a leak, a broken lock, or a faulty heater, a technician was on site within 1 day. No excuses, no supply chain lies. I fired every single one of Ryan's shady handyman friends, the ones who charged triple for labor and showed up drunk at noon. In their place, I signed exclusive contracts with a local construction firm owned by a Marine Corps veteran. For the first time in a decade, the rental units on Garnet Avenue were painted. The roofs were patched. The plumbing was overhauled. I didn't raise the rent by a single dollar. I simply stopped funding Ryan's lifestyle. And suddenly, the business was profitable enough to reinvest in itself. The change in the atmosphere was palpable. My inbox, once filled with threats of lawsuits from angry tenants, began to fill with thank you cards. One tenant, an elderly teacher named Mrs. Gable, baked me a loaf of banana bread. It was a small gesture, but it meant more to me than any applause at a cocktail party. Kindness and discipline, I realized, were not mutually exclusive. They were partners. Once the business was stabilized, I turned my attention to the house, Grandma Margaret's home. I spent a week purging the property. I filled contractor bags with the tacky, expensive junk Ryan had bought with stolen money. The curved gaming monitors, the designer sneakers left in the closet, the humidors for cigars he didn't smoke. I threw them all into a dumpster. I was exorcising the greed from the walls. While cleaning out the master bedroom, I found a leather-bound journal tucked under Grandma's mattress. It was dated from 5 years ago. I sat on the edge of the bed, the afternoon sun filtering through the dust motes, and opened it. Halfway through, I found an entry that stopped my breath. Ryan has his father's charm, but he also has his father's weakness. He needs to be liked. Alivia is different. She has sad eyes, but they are steady. She reminds me of my husband. She doesn't ask for attention, she asks for work. She will be the firekeeper of this family, even if the others are too blind to see it. The tears came without warning. For 32 years, I'd believed I was the disappointment. I'd believed I was the cold, unlovable daughter. But she had seen me. She had seen the truth beneath the uniform. I wept until my chest ached, releasing a lifetime of rejection. When I was done, I took the portrait of Grandma Margaret, the one taken when she bought her first truck, and hung it above the fireplace. The house felt lighter. It was no longer a crime scene. It was a home again. 2 months later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Mom. I hesitated. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but duty is a hard habit to break. I answered. Alivia? Her voice was thin, trembling, stripped of the condescending tone she'd used in the study that day. Hello, Mom. It is your father, she said, her voice cracking. His blood pressure spiked. He's at Scripps Memorial. And, Alivia, the bank sent a notice of default. They are going to foreclose on our house. We can't pay the second mortgage. We have nothing left. She paused, waiting for me to jump in, waiting for the old Alivia to offer to fix it. Con, can you help us, please? For the family. I took a deep breath. I thought about the disclaimer of interest she tried to make me sign. I thought about how she told me to sacrifice my rights because I was a woman. I will call the hospital billing department, I said, my voice steady. I will pay for Dad's current stay, directly to them. Oh, thank God, she sobbed. And the house? If you could just wire us $50,000, we could get current. No, I cut her off. What? I said no. I am not sending you cash, Mom. If I give you money, you will just find a way to funnel it to Ryan's legal defense fund or his next gambling scheme. I will ensure you have medical care, but I will not bail you out of your mortgage. You signed those papers. You bet your house on Ryan. You have to live with that bet. But we will be homeless, she cried. How can you be so cruel? It is not cruelty, Mom. It is accountability. I am teaching you the lesson you forgot to teach your son. I hung up before she could guilt me further. It hurt. It felt like cutting off a limb. But I knew that if I didn't hold that line, they would drag me down into the drowning pool with them. November arrived, bringing with it the cool coastal breeze. On Thanksgiving Day, I did not go to my parents' house. There was no shrimp cocktail. There were no pretenses. I hosted dinner at Grandma's house. The table was set with her good china. The air smelled of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, and wood smoke from the fireplace. My guests were a motley crew. There was Dylan, who had washed the grease off his hands and worn a nice shirt. There was Mrs. Gable from the rental unit. There were 2 of my fellow supply officers who didn't have family in town. And there was the contractor, the Marine veteran, who brought a pumpkin pie. We weren't bound by blood. We were bound by respect. I stood at the head of the table, the the seat my father used to occupy like a tyrant. I raised my glass. "To Margaret," I said. "To Margaret," everyone echoed warmly. I looked around the table at the smiling faces. There was no tension. No one was trying to manipulate me. No one was judging my gender or my salary. I realized then that I had spent my whole life trying to earn a seat at a table where I was never wanted, when all along I had the power to build my own table. I had found my tribe. And for the first time in my life, on this Thanksgiving, I was truly thankful. 3 months after the dust settled, my father asked to meet me. He didn't choose the country club or the steakhouse where he used to hold court with his business partners. He chose a small retro diner off the Pacific Coast Highway, a place where the coffee is served in thick white mugs and the menus are laminated. I arrived 10 minutes early, a habit I would never break. I watched from the booth as his car pulled into the lot. He wasn't driving his luxury sedan anymore. He was behind the wheel of a 10-year-old Toyota Camry, its bumper dented, the paint fading under the California sun. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who had commanded the room at the funeral with his booming voice and tailored suit was gone. In his place was a man who looked 10 years older, his shoulders slumped in a polo shirt that hung loosely on his frame. He sat down opposite me. He didn't look me in the eye. He stared at his black coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the sugar packets. "Ryan is facing trial next month," he said, his voice quiet, lacking its old resonance. "He refuses to speak to us. He says it is our fault. He says we spoiled him so much he never learned how to survive." Dad let out a short, bitter laugh. "And he is right." I stayed silent, letting him find his words. "I was blind, Alivia," he whispered, finally looking up. His eyes were red-rimmed. "I was so obsessed with the idea of the firstborn son, with the image of the Matthews name carried on by a man, that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. I had a diamond in my hand, and I threw it away to chase a piece of glass." It was the first time in 32 years that Thomas Matthews had admitted he was wrong. I looked at him across the Formica table. I waited for the anger to rise, for the old resentment to flare up, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange, heavy pity. He had spent his life building a shrine to his ego, and now he was sitting in the rubble. "I forgive you, Dad," I said softly. His head snapped up, surprise washing over his face. He looked like he expected me to scream, to gloat, to twist the knife. "I am not doing it for you," I continued, my voice steady. "I am doing it because I refuse to carry the weight of hating you for the rest of my life. That is a heavy pack to ruck, and I am setting it down." I leaned forward, establishing the perimeter of our new relationship. "But forgiveness is not amnesia. I will ensure the trust pays for your medical bills. I will ensure you and Mom have a roof over your heads. But you will never again have a say in my life. You will never advise me on the business. And you will never, ever try to manipulate me again. Those are the terms." He nodded slowly, a single tear tracking through the stubble on his cheek. It was a sad compromise, but it was a fair one. I left the diner before the lunch rush. I had work to do. That afternoon, I met with Mr. Davis to finalize the newest amendment to the Matthews Family Trust. We weren't buying more properties. We were investing in people. "Are you sure about this percentage, Alivia?" Mr. Davis asked, tapping his pen on the draft. 20% of gross profits is a significant amount." "I am sure," I replied. We established the Margaret Matthews Scholarship Fund. But it wasn't for everyone. It was specifically designated for the children of active-duty Navy petty officers, the enlisted men and women who work the hardest and get paid the least. I wanted to make sure that no 18-year-old girl would ever have to beg her parents for $50 to buy SAT books. I wanted to ensure that if a child had the drive to succeed, money would never be the barrier that stopped them. Grandma's legacy wouldn't just be a portfolio of stucco apartment buildings. It would be a ladder for the next generation to climb. That evening, I stood on the balcony of the Pacific Beach House. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. For the first time since I enlisted, my hair wasn't pulled back in a tight regulation bun. It was down, loose, whipping wildly in the salt breeze. I took a deep breath, tasting the salt air, feeling the vibration of the crashing waves in my chest. I reached into my pocket and touched the small leather Bible. I didn't need to open it to know the verse. It was etched into my bones now. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. I smiled. They had rejected me. They had tried to bury me. But they didn't know that I was a seed, not a corpse. The pressure they applied didn't crush me. It condensed me. It turned the coal into a diamond. I turned my back to the dark house and looked out at the horizon. The night was coming, but inside of me, the long, cold winter was finally over. It was morning. The most expensive lesson I learned wasn't about real estate or living trusts. It was about self-worth. For years, I waited for an apology that was never going to come. I thought if I just achieved enough, served enough, or endured enough, my family would finally see my value. But here is the truth. You cannot dry the ink on a story that someone else is writing for you. You have to grab the pen. If you are the black sheep or the scapegoat, stop trying to dye your wool white to please people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Don't wait for a seat at a toxic table. Go build your own. Thank you for standing watch with me until the very end. I know many of you listening right now are fighting your own silent battles, gathering your own evidence, and holding the line against injustice. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut ties to save your sanity? Or are you still planning your exit strategy? Type the word stone in the comments below if you are ready to become the cornerstone of your own life. And if this story gave you strength, please subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, you are never alone. You are part of this tribe now. Dismissed.